Hi, welcome. I hope you're doing well. My name is Victor Candid, and if that's the first time that you're joining us here, I do want to say welcome, and I hope that our content is helpful to you in some way. Do join us as we continue with our series on the psychology of different cultures. Today, I want to talk about the psychology of the Russian people and take a look at the Russian cultural mindset, if you will. Now, I think Russia's psychological landscape, it's shaped by its history. We can't deny that. At the same time, also their geography and some of the social norms in the country. Now, I think from the collectivist, or rather from the collective resilience that was built during Soviet times to strong sense of cultural pride that we see today among Russians, you find a Russian identity is kind of very complex. It's surrounded, I think, in tradition, and yet I think it's kind of managed to adapt to modernization. And so the content today, what we'll be doing today would be to sort of cover some of that and just try to look at some of the core elements of Russian psychology, such as the idea of collectivism, their resilience, their relationships with authority, and the overall attitude towards mental health. And I hope that this would help us understand what this is. And I will try to lace this talk or this video with some practical examples and theories from psychology and social psychology, or psychology and social sciences, to help us understand Russian psychology. Now, let's start with a bit of a historical influence or Russian psychology. I think it will have to start with the legacy of the Soviet Union, because you would imagine the Soviet history was still very much influential in Russian society texts, whether it's the collective attitudes of people, their interpersonal relationships, and even the role of the state. For example, many Russians still value their collectivist ideas and even mistrust rapid individual success, especially due to the legacy of Soviet equality. Now, way to look at this would be to think about it from a cultural historical theory, which shows how a society or history can shape a pattern. For example, for Russia, the Soviet collectivism has instilled a mindset in the Russian people, and this mindset prioritizes things like community needs over individual desires. And so the other thing that we could also think about when we think about the history and the background of the Russian people, Russian psychology, will be their national pride and resilience, because Russian history, as you know, it's marked by wars and invasion and harsh climate. Is very cold in Russia. And so these all culminating together fosters the resilience and proud national identity. For example, with World War II, or even what they call the Great Patriotic War, is still very much commemorated in Russia as a symbol of resilience and sacrifice for the country among Russians. And so you find that this Russian culture in itself emphasizes that idea of resilience and strength as a response to historical adversity, and they still carry that forward even to today into the future. And so every Russian president is always seen as this tough guy that kind of manipulative and kind of whatever, they have some kind of dark personality. And you could see that being conveyed. Whether or not that's the case is another thing. But overall, you could see where that's coming from. But the other part of this that I want to talk about would be their collectivism and their strong community bonds, because I think that in itself, it's seen in the way that the Russian family system works and how friendship is also a call to identity among Russians. Now, I think that Russians value close family relationships and even friendships, bonds. They often even prioritize these over career and individual goals. In fact, in Russian culture, it's often very common for families to live together across generations. And they do this because they want to foster a very strong bond among them. Now, you find that this in itself, it's an indication of some kind of collectivist mindset, which shows how close groups in this society, in this kind of society works. And they do this because they want to, it's an extension of the self and extension of their networks as well. And so family is very important and crucial in this context. And the other thing also that you would also find would be the deep friendships and friendships, which is very core to the Russian people. For example, they cultivate deep friendships, the idea of inner circle, having an inner circle. For example, Russians, they would place great importance on close friendships in such a way that they value quality over quantity. For example, it is very common for Russians to kind of have a small inner circle of trusted friends with whom they share their deep bonds. And so in that sense, a lot of Russians view acquaintances with caution. It's very difficult for Russians to have that kind of close bonds with people that they just met. Usually it takes time to build that kind of relationship, or those kind of relationships are often built at a very young age and sustain throughout the years to come. But which is why it becomes really difficult and challenging, even for Russians that are outside of their country. They find that it's very difficult to build bonds, relational bonds outside of the country, especially with people that are not Russian, because those relationships are things that are often forged at a very young age. And so I think in-group theory could be a good way to explain this, because it goes how Russians may form this kind of tight-knit, loyal circle. It's a way of reinforcing trust within their social groups and providing emotional security. And so if you're outside of that inner circle carcass, it becomes very difficult to break in or even forge relationship with a Russian. Now, I think relationship with authority and power distance is also another key thing that I want to mention or discuss as we talk about the Russian psychology. On one hand, as you would imagine, would be there is a high respect for authority figures within the Russian society. And so you find that many Russians would admire strong leaders, like Vladimir Putin, for example, and they would see them as protective figures who maintain national security and their history and their national pride. Of course, there will be dissenting voices once in a while, or people that oppose a country's leadership, which you'd always find was anyway. And so this power distance shows how cultures kind of view power and hierarchy. For Russians often show a high tolerance for power imbalance, especially with authority seen as a source of such structure. So any structure, any power outside of the established authority becomes something that is put to notice. Now, I do want to say that also there is also a strong desire for stability and order within the Russian society itself. Russians do value stability, and which is part of the reason why I think they're having challenges today in their country because of the need to kind of stabilize the country. But still, there are dissenting voices within the country that kind of shake the foundations of the country. And so even though Russians value stability, you would always find people that might not understand that. And maybe that might be the other reason why Putin might be fighting to kind of restore the order in the country, because of the need to just want things to be stable. Russia, in that sense, is very conventional or traditional. And so often they want to seek strong government control to avoid disorder or chaos of any kind. And so this reference for stability, it's seen even in the support for centralized government structures and the support for skepticism towards rapid political change. You find the government really trying to clamp down on dissenting voices that might want to create havoc to the structure. Now, I think a better way I could explain this would be using what is called the uncertainty avoidance theory, which suggests that cultures with high uncertainty avoidance prefer predictable, structured systems. Russians are generally very wary of instability, and so that's why they would often favor stable authority, essentially. On the other hand, I think I cannot talk about Russia without not mentioning about their resilience and endurance in the face of hardship. Now, if you've not known anything about Russia, I'm sure this is something that most people would actually, say without reading from anyone. The fact that Russians are very resilient and they have a strong endurance level. But I think this also stems from their cultural value of suffering with dignity, which is very much emphasized from a young age. Russians see resilience and endurance as essential values, essentially with suffering in itself often viewed as a test of strength. And so if you're in the Russian military, training routine, it's on a different level, on a different scale altogether. And so you find things like enduring harsh winters or even the economic hardship with sanctions from many nations. It's also seen as part of the Russian identity. In fact, to some degree, that the more sanctions that nations are giving to Russia, the more it kind of strengthens and reinforces their identity and you see that as they celebrate this in their literature and also in their arts as well. So this resilience becomes really crucial. They draw resilience from this. The Russians often draw this cultural strength through their hardship and things that they go through in a way that really fosters their resilience in the face of adversity. Now, the other part of this would be, I think, I'm trying to pronounce it well. It's being a stoicism. I'm sorry, I'm missing that, but forgive me. It's stoicism and emotional control, where for Russian culture they value emotional control. They value stoicism. I'm trying to pronounce it. I'm sorry. They value stoicism with expressions of emotions often being very reserved. In fact, I've known a lot of Russians in my life, even if they dated one at some point when I was younger. And I could tell you that that's something that is very common among Russians, that sense of emotional control and the expression of emotion. It's often very reserved just for close family friends alone and not for outsiders and people that are not within those inner circle that I mentioned. And so public display of often very uncommon with, of course, resilience and self-control highly valued, which is something that you'll find among any Russian. Now, of course, I would think that this Stoic philosophy does influence Russian attitude towards emotion because they view resilience as essential to sort of coping with life's hardship, essentially. Now, I do want to talk about their national pride and cultural identity. The Russian pride in their arts, in their literature and achievements. As you would imagine, Russians do take pride in their cultural contributions, including their literature, their ballet, their classical music, scientific achievements. So you find that a lot of Russian artists and literally and writers are well celebrated as a symbol of Russian cultural excellence. And so these achievements, as you would imagine, attribute to their collective pride and identity. Their pride, their culture honors these historical achievements as a source of national pride. I think language it's also a very important pillar of their identity. Russian language, as you would imagine, is true to their national identity, and it's often seen as a unifying force across different regions. No wonder that Putin is trying to bring back a region of that is in Ukraine that speaks Russian, right? So Russian language itself, I think, is used as a symbol of unity and pride, especially with many viewing it used as essential to kind of preserving their heritage overall. Now, when it comes to mental health and the stigma around seeking help within Russia, given the fact all the things I've mentioned, that stoic sense and that sense of emotional control and the need to suffer through hardship as a mark of resilience. Now, I think that, of course, impacts overall mental health because mental health in that terms is then conceived as a private matter. For example, mental health discussions are often avoided in Russia, especially with stigma still surrounding psychological support. There's still very much a stigma around that today. It's not very common for a Russian to study psychology, for example, in Russia. And so you find many Russians view mental health issues as personal and more likely to turn to family or their inner circle than to seek professional help. Now, this also is very much cultural, as I mentioned, because if your cultural belief is such that they see, say, mental health, or they emphasize the need to suffer in hardship as a way of building resilience, or emphasize stoic philosophy, the need for emotional control, you would imagine that you would grow up wanting to hide whatever feelings, emotions that you are having that might make you look or be perceived as weak. One way to explain this, I would say, would be with the health belief model, which sort of suggests that cultural beliefs affect health behaviors. In fact, in Russia, mental health, as you would imagine, it's often stigmatized due to the cultural belief in suffering and hardship as a way of building resilience, and also the cultural belief in emotional control, which of course affects people's openness to seek for help. Now, I think even though that's the case, they then emphasize resilience over therapy. So there is then the need, given this challenge within the Russian cultural landscape, there's an emphasis on resilience over therapy. And so Russians generally would emphasize enduring hardship over seeking mental health treatment. In fact, many Russians may see therapy as unnecessary. They do this because they believe instead in overcoming difficulties through resilience, right? Now, cultural relativity, if you will, kind of shows or indicates that attitudes towards mental health are really culturally specific. And as you would imagine, so with Russian culture, which values endurance, of course, it would naturally rather discourage people from seeking external support. Now, I hope you've picked up one or two things from all this and how we can understand the Russian mindset or the Russian psychology. I think their psychology, it's a mix of different things. Their very difficult, challenging history, their sense of pride and identity, their need for emotional control, given the emphasis on resilience in hardship over therapy, all this culminated together, of course, will make a Russian person to seem like that's sort of a tough cookie on the surface. But underneath that, they're also human beings craving for love, craving for support, craving to be understood. And I think one of the challenges in the world today is that almost anybody, the way the Western media paints Russia, they paint Russians or Russia as a country as a villain. And of course, how that would contribute to the need for most Russians to be resilient, given the hardship that they are born in, especially the way that the rest of the world perceives them. But let me know what you've learned from this, and feel free to drop a comment, your experience, for example, dealing with the Russian. And I would love to talk a bit more in the comment. But if you have more questions and thinking about other countries, make sure you check out some videos that we've already published earlier and where I talk about different other psychologies. I think you might enjoy it. And let's make this a conversation, especially as we engage with other cultures. We could do it in a way that's more informed and that would help us support the flourishing of other cultures. It's me, Victor Cannon. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye for now.